dystopian fiction has been moved to current affairs.
Hello, and welcome to Dystopian Fiction Has Been Moved to Current Affairs. Welcome to episode 23, where that's me, Claire, and my co host, Marsha, are going to be talking about the really fascinating and very beautiful film, The End We Start From, with Jodie Comer, available on Netflix. And Marsha has the task of telling us what it's all about. So over to you.
So, The End We Start From gives nothing away in the title.
Not even by the end of the film, do we know what the title is
not even
about?
by the end of the film. Me and Claire were literally saying we have no idea what the title really means. But the main plot is that there is some torrential rain that causes really bad flooding across all of the UK, sort of similar to what's going on right now in Central Europe, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So yes, all of these sort of lower ground cities like London and stuff are chased out of, all these residents chased out of their city by these rising water levels, and they're all having to evacuate into the higher parts of the country, where Jodie Comer has just had her baby son with her partner, I think. I'm not sure if they're married
I
actually.
don't know whether we learn.
By Joel Fry. And yeah, they basically try to save themselves by initially traveling to Buxton, and then after running out of food because there's a food shortage, her and Joel Fry get separated, and Jodie Comer's on her own with her baby. And you sort of go through the different places that she decides to take herself and her child to evacuate. And yeah, at the end, she gets reunited, Joel Fry. And you know what? One of the only dystopias where I actually feel like there is like a slightly happy ending to it. Which also really quite, I think, set this film apart. I think me and Claire were just discussing that. I really personally liked it. I watched it with a friend, and we were quite surprised because all the reviews were like, I think there's a bit of a disparity between like critic reviews and just like general viewership reviews. But they were quite low, and we're like, oh, we didn't have much
It's weird.
expectations.
I mean, we're saying it's kind of about expectations. If you're going into this expecting some sort of like high power post-apocalyptic, race against the flooding kind of film, it's really not like that. It's a lot of close-up shots of Jodie Comer, and lots of amazing landscape and lots of water, and it's really kind of intense, but it's not especially plot driven, although there is a plot. It's much more, say, about kind of like a character's journey and exploring ideas around motherhood and family and love and safety within the construct of I suppose a very realistic idea about what it would be like if we had mass flooding on this kind of level. But it is beautiful.
Yeah, it's really like the cinematography we were just saying is gorgeous and really interesting, like camera work there, especially in the first like 10 minutes where we're seeing Jodie Comer in her house and she's pregnant and she's about to go into labor, and yet the water levels are rising, and it's got that real anxiety about it, but it also has like, I don't know, these really beautiful shots of what's going on, and it's just I think the visual art style of the movie was great. Just really nice. And also the sound in it really elevated the whole kind of like anxiety aspect for me. Like it was really making me quite stressed, which I think is a sort of an indicator of of a story well
considering
done.
that actually, although we know that there's a lot of loss of life and we see some of that, and there is, none of the sort of fear stuff is overplayed. It's much more a natural human fear of well, I suppose having nowhere to go, having no one to turn to, and having a child to look after, that really kind of comes through. We should probably say that we're referring to our characters by the names of the actors, and we'll try and remind you who they are, because there are no character names except for the babies, who we do not know the actors' names, largely because there were many babies involved.
Very many babies.
But
15 whole babies.
15 whole babies, exactly, yes. I have to say, because I need to get it in somewhere, because it's my absolute favorite line in the whole film, the bit where Jodie Comer's friend played by Catherine Waterston turns to her, well, Jodie says, have we eaten all of the food? And her friend says, well, we have these delicious babies.
Yeah, these delicious babies.
Many delicious
Yeah.
babies were not harmed in this film. But I agree with you. If we start from that kind of that opening scene, it's this simplicity really of the very pregnant woman having a bath. I mean, I don't know, I'm one of these people who has no children out of choice and finds pregnancy quite disturbing, the little alien
that whole entire like
pressing against the skin and so
oh
on.
God. I was just like, never want to get pregnant. Oh God, it literally made me so like upset. I was like, no, thank you.
No. I suppose there is a feeling, I suppose, that it's beautiful in its way, but it's also, we feel some of her kind of uncertainty around it, and the way that she kind of, you know, talks to this unborn child and so on, within the tension of knowing that, I guess, the metaphor of kind of her waters breaking and her going into labor, with the water breaking
water
into
actually
the,
like
home.
into the house. Yeah.
So, and just the simple things like the way that she's eating the mango, that seems like something very normal, and then it's not long from there to having nothing to eat.
Yeah.
Journey of the film. So some amazing use of the kind of the water tank and the breaking in through the window. I was reading, by the way, in this that this was filmed in some specialist article earlier, and it was all filmed on film. It's Kodak films, if you want to know. They do
such an art house film.
I know, it is.
Even with the no-named characters, the film, Christ.
No, absolutely. And yet it's not, I don't think it's pretentious.
It's very accessible, you know. Like, I don't think, if you don't think too deep into it, like, this is just like all the information I found out afterwards. So I didn't even notice that the characters didn't really have any names.
No, I know.
Like, you don't really notice that. It's so, I don't know, it's a very like touching film, and you don't have to be like super, I don't know, you know, you don't have to be super well educated or something to like understand what's happening or connect with what is happening on screen to the characters.
Yeah, it takes that idea, I guess, of what you can do with film to make something beautiful. It reminds me a little bit of films where, again, on the one hand, it uses the landscape a lot and the idea of travel. So in that sense, it's not like a stage play, but it has those sort of play elements to it as well, where you're just kind of like really focused on a character and their kind of like their facial expressions and their movement and so on. And yeah, I mean, it's a tremendous performance, I think, by Jodie Comer particularly. But as we say, yeah, I think that if you've got any sort of doubts about whether you would like to have children or not, this is probably not the film to watch the opening scenes of, because yeah, you know, nice graphic birth scene and so on.
Yes.
What did you think about the kind of like our initial introduction to these characters? I guess so, like Joel Fry and Jodie Comer kind of bonding over their child. How did you feel that we were supposed to
that kind of
think about them?
Is that like after the birth kind of thing?
Yeah, I guess so, because like we get Joel on the phone, don't we? But we don't really see him until he like finally gets to the hospital.
Yeah. Over the phone, so Joel Fry was like introduced, and at first I was like, oh, is he sort of like not an absentee father, but kind of like, you know, is there some sort of long distance aspect to it? Like, why is she on her own? You know, all these kind of questions are coming in. But he did show up at the hospital, which was, and like he seemed very caring. He was like being very like hands-on with the child. I don't know, it felt like they had a good, strong connection. And like I sort of seeing how that like relationship then kind of goes on. It just felt very touching.
It does, yeah. I think I would use that word as well. There's something about them where it's like showing love, but not through like massive romantic gestures.
Yes. It's just very like between the two like individuals, it feels very kind of like intimate, the way that like their affection for each other is portrayed on screen. I think like as the like movie goes on, I think it's kind of like revealed that they haven't even really been that like together that long.
No.
Like in terms of the timeline of when, from the point that they got together to like the point that they are, you know, having had the baby. And yeah, so Joel Fry and Jodie Comer, you travel to Joel Fry's parents' house, and you know, from that they're discussing it, and sort of we're having these flashbacks, and it doesn't actually seem that long that
No,
they've been
that's
together
right.
for.
She explains later on in the film, I think, doesn't she, that, you know, we see how they met eventually, much later in the film, we see how they met, and the sort of way in which they went from strangers to knowing each other in this sort of short space of time. But she explains that her parents both died quite close together, and she became obviously severely depressed by this and unable to cope and having an irrational fear of death. And he'd kind of looked after her, and then she'd become obsessed with having a baby, and they'd had a baby. So but there is something about their love, which you learn later on is obviously based in this idea of his deep care for her and the way that, you know,
Yeah.
he'd looked after her through this. But it's also based quite a lot on, like, you know, this sort of this humor that it's not like hilariously funny, but it's like kind of endearing humor when they're trying to name the baby, and he's like Noah or Bob. It's like
Also, but then Zeb, like, what does Zeb even mean? Is that
it's
short for
usually short for
something?
Zebedee.
Like
Zebedee. Yeah,
Zebedee.
but they didn't go down that route. Zebedee is
Just Zeb.
it's a Hebraic name, but it's also a character in the Magic Roundabout, which I think is what pretty much everybody thinks of. Zebedee. But yeah,
Zebedee.
So
Okay.
still one of the few characters who gets a name in this whole thing.
Yeah, I think
Zeb and Lily, I think,
actually
are the only two.
the only one. Who knows?
Yeah, the other
I don't
baby,
know.
Lily, gets introduced.
The other baby, Lily.
Yeah.
I guess, like, what do you think the sort of, I don't know, like, relevance of that is? Like,
is there something about the sort of every person sort of situation? Like, none of the characters are particularly special in their own right, you know. He's an engineer, she's a does the hair for breakfast TV shows. So successful in their respective fields, but not
like particularly
heroic
special
or special in some way. So maybe there's something about that. I suppose the thing that I would probably say is that I don't think I'd have been certain that they didn't have names unless we were doing this podcast. And I tried to find out what their bloody names were, you know, so we could talk about it.
No, exactly.
So, yeah.
I don't know. For me, I actually interpreted it more as like, oh, maybe it's putting into focus by giving the like two children names in the like in the movie. I keep saying TV show, it's not TV show. In the movie, that's putting into focus the sort of next generation that's going to inherit the world that like they've just lived through. I don't know, maybe kind of like in terms of that kind of sustainability and
I think that's a really valid point, because we don't see a great deal of sort of, you know, it's quite a few mentions of kind of like what sort of world have we brought you into, but less of the sort of was it right to bring you into this world. There's more a kind of instinctive desire to kind of like have children. Maybe we can come back to this when we talk a bit more about the kind of women's friendship and the way that they talk about motherhood there. But yeah, I mean, the whole idea around the sort of the climate crisis element here, we're obviously looking at something that this is a world that looks pretty much like our world now, sort of near future, in the way that maybe they talk about this idea of kind of, you know, we knew that this was coming, but nobody did anything about it, and nobody did anything about it at a state level, and nobody did anything about it at a local level. People didn't leave, you know, there's a lot of stuff. Oh, you know, we just sort of thought we'd ride it out. We didn't leave when we could. Even the joking on the phone at the beginning when they're like, you know, the people from number 32, whatever it is, have gone. And what Joel Fry is like, oh, I like that dog. She's like, no. So not really taking seriously the idea that, you know, there might have been a need to leave sooner than they did, which I suppose reflects this idea that, you know, we're not acting on not only stopping the causes of climate crisis, but also in actively preparing homes so that they can withstand flooding and changing our infrastructure. And it's also the way that building regulations and things like that are not have not been sort of brought up to date in order to prevent the building on floodplains, and we've got dredging of bogs and things like that. We've got the slow but so and somewhat limited reintroduction of beavers. We need lots of beavers. That is that's the quote that people will take from this. It's a bit of a beat moment. Claire says we need lots of beavers. Yes,
lots of beavers.
Yeah, the world is better with. So yeah, there's this whole kind of idea that, you know, we've got to mitigate against these circumstances. And as you mentioned, you know, this is something that is we're seeing in Europe, in major cities in Europe.
Yeah.
But of course, we also, I guess, we tend to turn a blind eye to the most extreme effects of the climate crisis already kind of disproportionately hitting the global south, and the fact that we've got
Mm.
places like Bangladesh and Pakistan where entire villages are being wiped out. We've got mass casualties. We've got huge refugee movements. And I guess, again, we were talking about this quotation meme that goes around a little bit where some variant or other on this idea that dystopian fiction is when you take things that happen in real life to marginalized populations and apply them to people with privilege. And that's what this is, you know, that's what this film is. It's basically saying, oh, look, you know, you can become a climate refugee in your own country, you know, but oh, let's just remember that this is a real thing. It's happening across the world, and particularly in places where the populations are poorer, the color of their skin is not white, and therefore we don't necessarily pay them the same attention, even though almost certainly the rising sea levels that have brought this about, rising sea levels, you'll know about this because you are my scientist to go for all things. But is that as temperatures rise, water vapor forms and maintains longer in the air?
Yes.
That's where you get more
Yeah,
rain?
so water vapors are actually considered to be like a greenhouse gas, so also contributes to the warming of the climate. So
Mm.
yeah, as you know, yeah, exactly. And the sea levels rise due to the melting of like ice caps and stuff and the glaciers, and that's why, yeah, it's all it's kind of like a little feedback loop. So
Yeah.
yay, yay,
And pretty much
warmer
these problems
climates.
have been created by us in the wealthy West, and not
Yeah,
being hit so much by them, which is why a film like this that sort of brings life. And I should say, we have had terrible flooding in this country, just not yet on the scale that we see in other places. But it would be worth saying,
no.
it's something
And
that,
also not places that like, you know, not places like the capital city of London where, you know, all these
yeah. And I think
like
that's one of the things
probably
it does, isn't
CEOs are
it?
harboring themselves.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, you know, that little village in Derbyshire's got
yeah,
a flooded
exactly.
event again. Oh
Yeah,
well, oh, what a
yeah,
shame.
precisely.
Yeah.
And I was looking at the sort of flood warning map, and it's interesting that there are places in and around London where the flood defences are not sufficient. Hackney, I think, was
Really?
mentioned,
Yeah.
and so on. But obviously,
Mm.
generally, people sort of think, oh, we know Thames Barrier, flood defences, so on, will be fine in London. And it is
Mm.
pretty, like that scene at the very end where they're going on the boat down past these double-decker buses with the water up to the top. Um,
Mm, mm.
one of the few bits that was actually filmed on a green screen, but I don't think that it's particularly badly done for that.
No, no, not at all.
Obviously, the film feels like, I don't know what the budget was, but it feels like it's sort of, you know, fairly tight budget, and maybe the
And
flooding of
to be
flood
fair,
not an
they
option.
did have like a pretty stacked cast. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. They even had Benedict Cumberbatch, which, by the way, there's this really funny review that I read on Letterboxd. Everyone get on Letterboxd and follow us. Maybe we should start a little Letterboxd
Oh, okay.
account for
Yeah.
the pod. But
Yeah.
someone said a murmur of approval went through the crowd when it was revealed that the mystery man offering food was Benedict Cumberbatch, which I was like, to be
So
honest,
good.
exactly. I literally like I was sat with my friend and it's like, it's Benedict Cumberbatch. Literally just like shouted it out loud. I was like, oh, I'm
So
so
true, so true.
excited.
Yeah,
Um,
it's his production company.
oh, is it? Is that why he
Yeah,
made a
so
cameo?
yeah, but you know,
Oh,
that's you're right. They're just generally like, even though none of these roles is particularly huge, really, other than kind of Jodie
no,
Comer,
Jodie
um,
Comer, yeah.
we have a really amazing cast throughout. So we sort of talked about this kind of setting of the sort of personal situation, domestic situation of this couple who should be, I guess, in a fairly good position, right? They're both in well-paying jobs. They have this really quite beautiful home. You know, to be fair, you know, Jodie Comer does get to hospital and deliver her baby safely, although we already see the fact that this hospital is being evacuated because of the impact of the flooding. And there's this sort of, you know, way in which she doesn't get the time to kind of really learn how to breastfeed and so on. It's all done terribly, kind of hurriedly. And, you know, just they're sent out, oh, that again, this is why it just felt like so stressed like throughout most of this film. But the bit where they're trying to get out of the hospital with the baby in the carrier, and they're like wading through water, and there's like nothing like terribly sort of, there's no tidal waves coming or anything like that, but just the idea of carrying like a 1-day-old baby
Oh, a Buntail
through
baby. Oh
floodwater.
no, literally, again, had just made me so like, God, imagine having a child, like, let alone the flooding and all this like terrible destruction
Yeah,
and
exactly.
evacuation
It
stuff.
would bring a
Just,
child into
oh
this
God.
world and so be
No,
responsible
because just
for
also like, imagine how much like disease and stuff is like coming up from like the sewage and things. Like, just even
it.
that like first day of flooding, like,
Yeah.
you would not want to bring out your like newborn
Yeah.
baby out onto those
Yeah.
streets. Like, imagine accidentally dropping it or something. Oh God, the
That's my
nightmare, the
constant fear
nightmare.
with babies. I've got a bit
It
better
would be
now. There are
bad to
more
drop it
babies in my life.
anyway.
But
Yeah. Always,
yeah,
it's the trick to like hold their head. It's like,
that's the one.
I
Yeah.
actually watched
Oh,
a
hold
film
that.
recently where like the baby was passed over to some man and he just like held the back of this baby. I was like, what about the head? Support the head. Where's the realism in this show? Okay, it's ridiculous, but yeah, no, I was just like, oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's shocking,
No, I mean,
shocking.
the babies have to go through just in the filming process quite a lot in
Yeah,
this whole thing. But yeah, the spread of disease is obviously something that we don't really see explored so much, largely because I guess
yes.
we haven't got that kind of macrocosmic view and we haven't got the sort of long-term
Mm,
effects. But it is worth remembering that that is one of the sort of we see these
yeah,
lovely things about crop destruction, which is obviously just in like people's her garden and in the in-laws garden, this idea of what happens when your allotment becomes kind of waterlogged, and so there's
yeah,
a nice microcosm there. But yeah, this I guess the individual focus has this real effect. But we've talked a bit about lack of prevention and the struggles of the infrastructure to cope with everything that happens. But we also see this kind of like local response, which I think is quite shocking, where villages on high ground and so on start closing their roads to incomers. And
mm,
that nearly includes our intrepid couple and their 2-day-old baby. And there's sort of the scene with the man with the clipboard, and presumably he relents because of the age of the child. But how did you feel about that? Because that was another bit where I started getting really stressed, because it's like this idea of like your home is completely flooded out, you have nowhere to go, you've been kicked out of the hospital that is closing, you try to go to your family and you can't get into the village.
So no, I genuinely, again, I think we were saying about how the sort of film does these cuts in the
Mm.
movie, and like then you see the next bit. Like we were saying with the section where they were like, we're not going to separate, we're not going to split
Mm.
up going into the shelter, and then the next cut is to like Kyra in the shelter. But this is one of those ones where the security man like walks away, the like whoever the traffic, whoever, the man in the high vis walks away, and I'm like,
Yeah.
he's gonna say no, like they're not going to get in, and then here they are like rolling up to their parents' house, and so that was an effective cut, again, just elevates
Yeah.
that like level of like, oh my God, anxiety. But yeah, I don't know, but then again, it's like, if they're going to make the exception for this one family with a
Mm.
2-day-old baby, surely there's like a million other like 2-day-old babies in the same
Yeah.
park,
Yeah.
parked up cars and lines and stuff. I don't know, I just
And I
I
guess
don't
one
know,
of the things about that cut is we're just left to kind of think about the sort of what would you do sort of thing
yeah,
without
what
going
would you
through the
do?
kind of arguments of that. And there is a bit where, so the parents, so Joel Fry's parents, as it were, played by
Mhm.
Mark Strong and Nina Sasanya. So again, more amazing like
More
actors turning up
crazy
at this point.
actors, yeah.
And a neighbor comes to visit, and you can see her kind of like misery and
Distress,
resentment
yeah.
at seeing that they're there when her son hasn't got through.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so we are left with that kind of like, we're pleased for our protagonists, but they're just two lucky people. And it also turns out that Nina Sasanya has been like pickling all vegetables for all time, and therefore has like
And
so
she's
many
like,
jars.
you
If you want
called
a
me
little
a hoarder,
jam,
but now
fine.
who's laughing?
Yeah.
It's such an
Um,
iconic line.
yeah, and that's one of the things that in a way kind of keeps them safe and isolated, and not really kind of, we don't feel aware of the world outside. It's much more the kind of like, Joel's got this idea of doing up adjoining property or whatever, the sort of slightly wrecked houses on their land, and both grandparents enjoying time with their grandchild, and
Yeah.
kind of the restoration of some degree of kind of the intimacy that gets lost with a couple when they're just dealing with like a newborn all the time. We sort of see some of that coming back with
Yeah, it's just really, again, just like their relationship. I love Joel Fry. You know, live, laugh, love, our flag means death. Literally nothing in that. But
Did you find him a bit sort of insipid? As in like kind of sort of like slightly annoying to start with?
really,
Yeah, I don't know whether it was just me.
and like what bits like was
I guess
he?
but
Yeah, did
you're
he
right.
come
He
across
does
that way?
the good fathering thing and so on, but just I don't know. Maybe what I'm doing is I'm actually kind of like reflecting the way that Jodie Comer starts to feel about him, because she, I think, although there's this kind of like big theme of like the love and the idea of getting back to him
Yeah,
home and so on, she also, I think, when although it's not his fault that she and the baby go into the shelter and he isn't allowed to go, um,
yeah.
it's like she blames him, which I think is completely like natural.
Do you
Like
think that's true? I
I
don't
feel
know
there's
whether
a
like
I
she
felt there was a sort of undercurrent of anger against him,
really.
even though
I
it's
actually
obviously
didn't.
not anger against him.
Yeah, I didn't really interpret it that way. I think like I don't know. I don't think I like. I don't know. It's interesting for your interpretation because I maybe like some of that might have come across, especially like when he was being quite shut off with his like mother and father just having died. Oh my god!
Yeah.
Literally that bit where like Jodie Comer approaches Mark Strong and he's just standing next to a tree. I
Okay,
was so
right.
expecting for them to turn the camera around and someone has like hung themselves. I was
Yeah.
like so. I was again that whole entire like section whilst they're at the grandparents' house. I was so stressed out. I was
Yeah.
like, no, I was like, I don't want
Okay.
to watch this anymore.
Right.
This
Let's
is
go through the most tense bit then. They eventually
yes.
run out the feed and they head off into Buxton, I assume, into
Mm,
town, or into the sort of nearest hub where they hope to be able to get
some
food.
food, yeah.
And one of the things that I think is really amazing about this film is the way in which it uses a lot more us not knowing and imagining what might be happening than it
What
does
might be
actually
happening, yeah.
showing the terrible things that happen. And this is sort of a high point of this. First of all, the idea that Jodie Comer is left on her own, and to start with, that feels fine. And then as it goes on,
Mm.
they're still not back. And the father and son come to the house seeking shelter, and it
Yes, like
seems,
a
I
yeah,
think,
separate
whatever.
father and son.
Yeah.
I think they're actually just looking for food. And again,
Yeah.
it's like one of those moments of like there's a number of different things that could happen right
Mm.
now. Like, you know, this random man, stranger could attack her and her
Mm.
child, like whatever. Then he also has a child with
Yeah.
him. And I think, you know, the way it goes down in the movie is that yeah, like this man and his child just come have a meal and then they leave. And then there's that
Yeah,
little moment where
absolutely.
the 10-year-old boy says thank you or say like leave, but like the whole entire interaction just goes in silence from them as
Yeah.
like Jodie Comer's like, oh yeah, my like partner and his parents are
Yeah.
gonna be back soon, they're gonna
Yeah.
be back soon, like we don't have that much food. And
Yeah.
but
And
yeah.
it's like, the baby, I can't, I have baby. And
Mm,
you can see that conflict in her of like fear of what they might do, the desire to help, but the fact that she can't trust anybody
you
anymore,
can't, yeah.
which obviously then prefigures what has actually happened while the in-laws and her partner are away getting food. And it is awful. I think the way the like way in which the car pulls up and
Mm-hmm.
Joel Fry sort of staggers past her and won't let her touch him, and then she goes to help uh
Mark Strong, yeah.
Strong, and he also won't let her touch him, and there is simply no sign of
Yeah,
Senya.
so we don't really know what happens to the mother like
No,
properly.
it
Well,
comes
obviously
out
there's
in
assumptions
dribs
she's
and drabs,
died, yeah.
doesn't it?
Yeah, so I think we only find out what happens at the point that Joel Fry and Jodie Comer go themselves to this like food checkup point, and Joel Fry's like, they trampled on my mum's neck, they trampled on my mum's neck, and there's so yeah, after this sort of like traumatic things happens with his mother, and obviously Joel Fry's dad also shoots
Shoots
himself.
himself with a shotgun.
Horrific, horrific. But
which again we don't see, we just
we
hear
don't
the
see, we just
shot
hear the
knowing that he's gone
shotgun.
away from the house. Yeah, that's
God, I can't even imagine like this inconveniencing. I don't know, like maybe like I didn't interpret it that way, but I can imagine some people might find it quite like frustrating, like Joel Fry's response thereafter to like the whole situation. But at the same time, I feel like I think he's always very gentle with
yeah,
Jodie when she's like,
yeah,
"Oh, like I love you. I'm gonna look after you. Like, do you want to speak to me about it?" And he just goes, "I can't." And I can imagine like so many different people, probably including myself in that situation, would lash out and be like, "Oh, just fuck off" or whatever,
yeah.
like. But he's consistently very gentle, and yeah, he is going through this traumatic experience, but he never like directs that at her in a way that I
No,
would say is
that's true.
unreasonable.
Yeah,
And like
yeah,
ultimately he makes the decision that will, like, yeah, there is a little bit of that where they're about to go, they decide after kind of not being able to get any food supplies that they're gonna have to go to the shelters, and it's one child, one primary caregiver, and obviously Jodie Comer is going to be the mother that goes
yeah.
into the shelter with Zeb, but like yeah, there's like this conversation that they have where Joel Fry is kind of just like, oh, I feel like I'm dying. I feel like I'm useless. So you're gonna die with me, and that is a bit kind of like, oh, for Christ's sake, pull yourself together. But at the same time, I think there is this almost a sense of like him being a bit like realistic in terms of
Yeah, I mean,
what is he actually able to achieve with
it's
the like.
true. And I think, yeah, I mean, I do think it's actually a very powerful representation of kind of grief, PTSD, having seen,
Mm,
what's happened to his mother and being helpless.
Let's be honest, yeah, for a man
Mm,
who's just had both his parents die,
yeah.
we've seen how Jodie Comer's parents like deaths, like she explains how that affected her. She literally
Yeah.
went into depression where she
Yeah.
couldn't even like do anything, whilst like Joel Fry's parents have just died, and now he's like kind of going through, well, again, we're putting in quotation marks, the apocalypse, because
Yeah.
it's just like these things happen to people all the time,
Mm,
even
yeah.
now in Central Europe. But like, yeah, he's going through this kind of like terrible natural disaster, and like he doesn't even really thinking about it have time to
There
process the
is
fact his
no
parents
time to
died. It's like
process or grieve.
it's a
And
survival
yeah,
factor. And I think, to be honest, like I think in my eyes, his character deals with it in a way that feels realistic, but at the same time
yeah.
it's just very like down to the point of like, look, I can't look after you right now, like, and the most important thing is for you and our son to survive. I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know. It's interesting how you interpret it, but I
I
thought his
think that,
character was very kind of, I don't know. Yeah, if I was to have a partner to look after my child, it'd be Joel Fry.
yeah,
Joel
okay. So
Fry.
I think that there is, yeah, there's a definite realism to the character. And I think that the way in which it portrays grief and also the helplessness of somebody when you're trying
Yeah,
to speak to somebody about their grief, the way that Jodie Comer just keeps saying, I'm so sorry, which is what we all do.
yeah,
It doesn't do anything. It's just that we don't
no,
have words in those circumstances. So I think that is very powerful. And when he's like naked and bruised in the bath and like all curled up
yeah,
and so on, yeah, there is the way in which that's kind of like reducing somebody to sort of like being a child, being washed by a
mm,
parent and so on. I thought that was very powerful. I think the thing that I found annoying, which I think comes down to this sort of thing that I guess was difficult for maybe Jodie Comer's character, depending on how we interpret it, was the way in which he was like, I can't protect you, in a way that
mm,
to me really suggested this kind of like patriarchal idea that he as the man must protect his wife and
yeah,
child, whereas she was much more like, no, we're a unit, we're together. But I guess when we look at the sort of context where he had to kind of like look after her and bring her out of surviving her
yeah,
depression and so on, maybe there is something there. One of the things that we learn much, much later in the film is that when they first meet, they're talking about living in London, and he's like, "No, I'd much rather like build myself a hut
a
and
hut in the woods. Yeah,
live off catching things or whatever." And she's like, "No, I love London. I like the inside. I like when
I
people
like
bring me food
and my
and then they have
microwave
to."
meals. She's like, I'm not fussy. And
Yeah,
he's like,
yeah,
oh, you guys,
yeah.
oh, we're doomed
Themed,
then,
exactly. So that
which is
kind of
so
like
funny.
sense
Yeah.
of what happens when that takes like comes out of sort of like the sort of, I guess, the hypothetical date conversation or whatever into kind of the reality of who is
Mm.
going to survive and how is really, really interesting. So do you think that they do the right thing when, so we get this hard cut from Jodie Comer saying, no, we're not going to be separated, to her being separated. In this, this shelter where they do at least have food and beds and so on, but it's pretty horrific. But do you think it was the right decision to put her in there, even though it separated the family?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, like, if there's no other option, like, there's a number of, like, obviously being in a natural disaster, the outflow of a natural disaster isn't great for a baby anyway, but also, like, having a starving mother, who's your main source of, like, food, and how, like, Joel Fry says, like, you're his entire ecosystem.
Yeah, that's right.
It's
she
true,
breastfeeds
like,
him throughout the film, so we get that, that sort of, as you say, that interconnectivity that can't be lost. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm with you as well. I can see. I think it's more than just emotional that Jodie Comer doesn't want to separate the family, but I do think in terms of the sort of care for the child and the most practical.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the most practical.
It's sensible.
Yeah. What do you think of, like, throughout the movie, like, how, I mean, both of us don't have children, but, like, the sort of, like, mother-child portrayal, like, how her relationship with her baby, and also how her American friend that she meets in the shelter, like, what their relationship as friends is, and also both as them being mothers, like, how did that make you feel?
Think that often, I guess, as somebody who doesn't have and doesn't want children, I can often find the depiction of motherhood in stuff where it's a central theme really kind of cloying, and it can become this kind of like, oh, if you're not a mother, then you're missing out on something absolutely wonderful. And I'm like, yeah, but look at me with my actual money
and freedom,
free time, and
so
all
true.
of that. But no, I mean, this, I feel, is a film that is much, much more honest about people's decisions around having children and about how they feel about their children. Both some sort of like primal instinct in a way to protect their child, as I think anybody would feel if they're apart from those whose mental health affects them sort of bonding with their child. But I think most of us, this idea of protecting a child at all costs is a fairly sort of natural instinct. But it doesn't it doesn't make it saccharine, it doesn't make it sort of overly sweet and lovely. And that's largely, I think, down to Jodie Comer's real honesty about kind of like why she wanted a child. She got so afraid of the idea of dying that she thought that she should have a child to kind of like negate that new life, to negate death. Instead of which, of course, then she's just terrified about her child, really. But
and I think her American friend says something like really kind of important. I don't know. It feels like real in terms of the fact that she says like, "Oh, no one's ever decided to have a child out of altruism." And I was
exactly,
like,
I was like,
to be honest,
with that, absolutely. And even from the like beginning of them first meeting, and Jodie Comer's like, oh, Lily, the other baby, is so cute, and Catherine Waterston's like, yeah, she's all right, she better stay like this because it's sort of like a really sort of like down to earth, having a child is beautiful and wonderful, and I love her, but it's also annoying and hard work. And both of them ended up in a shelter without the fathers of their children in their lives. And Catherine Waterston again has got this background where like the father walked out and she's like, oh yeah, he's probably dead, he couldn't swim. And it's just like again, I guess it's a sort of blunt crassness, maybe partly reflecting kind of a cultural difference because of the fact that she's an American, and Jodie Comer is British. But there is something there, I think, about the maternal instinct, but not making it something that is like, Jodie Comer would have a much easier time of this whole thing if she didn't have a child, and I don't think that we're
child with her.
Oh
god, yeah. I mean, even though like the point again, another like, oh my god, babies, like sounds like a terrible thing to have, but like the bit where the shelter gets raided by those people, and like it's Jodie Comer and Catherine Waterston with the two babies just like wrapped to their chests, and they're like running, carrying these backpacks, and it's just like, oh god, I think I literally would throw up and probably pass out on the spot, to be honest. But after the point of the shelter, so like the two women start traveling to the commune, and it's like it's a great to talking about that.
yeah, I mean, I really love this story of a women's friendship. Again,
Yeah,
it feels like it's a million miles from kind of your sort of like rom-com kind of women's friendship kind of thing.
yeah,
It has aspects of quite a sort of like deep, almost kind of queer relationship, but without any sexuality to
yes,
it.
yes, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
it's
I also picked up
also
kind
like
of that
obviously like
vibe, but yeah,
passes the Bechdel test a million times over.
yes.
So
I was literally gonna say that as well.
that's
Yes.
um
Yeah.
but it not only does it sort of show the way in which kind of like these two women help each other to form essentially like a dual parenting of their children because of the advantages of being able like one woman being able to take both, or like showing each other's kind of like things that they found work with their children and so on. But it's also kind of like in the hardest times just kind of like singing together and so on. What is it they're singing? Oh, Dirty Dancing, isn't it? I've had the time of my life echoing across the hills and so on. But it also shows the way that women fear men in a way that I think is really powerful. You know, we've talked before about being in a wood with a man or a bear, and this is like these are the men often that make us think, you know, nothing necessarily happens, but it's just like this is why I might prefer a bear because I just don't know
Mm,
what's going to happen. And
yeah.
particularly the bit where they, as you say, they run from this like insurgence of starving men, I think, principally with guns,
Hmm.
break into the shelter, and they throw themselves into a car being driven by two men whom they don't know, and nothing happens. But we know, I don't know, maybe as sort of like women and non-binary people, this sort of fear of being in a confined space with two men who you don't know, where you can't get
Mm.
out, and they don't respond when she says, you know, slow down, and so on. I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah, yeah. It was like scary as well.
Yeah,
It was just like, oh my
exactly.
God.
But scary for like a reason that isn't quite tangible somehow, which I
Yeah,
think is,
yeah.
you know, again, that thing that a lot
It
of us
was,
experience.
yeah, in a very like similar moment, which I'm sure we can like talk about more in depth in a bit, but when Jodie Comer, after she's left the commune, which we're going to come back to, she is walking many miles, eventually can't walk any further, and like finds this like sort of couple with a car, and she's like, oh, can I catch lift? This woman's like, no, 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 no. And like there's this a bit of this moment where this man comes over, which we didn't initially realize was on screen, and this woman keeps going, no, 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 and this man's like holding this woman, going like, I'm gonna deal with her. Don't you worry. And I had this like fear of like, what is this man gonna do to Jodie Comer? I was like, there's like a like the sort of first things that like ran through my mind is like, was this like other women saying no because she was like, please leave. My partner's gonna come and do something horrible to you. It was like the first thing that I had thought, even in the context of like men having other, like women partners, it was still that kind of like fear of like, what is this man gonna
Yeah.
do?
And it was interesting,
Um,
I think, in a way that we had taken that journey from being sort of like, you know, oh, people can be good to each other. They can help each other. You know, Jodie Comer and Catherine Waterston and their friendship and so on
mm,
is a good example of this. The Benedict Cumberbatch moment
I'm
is
gonna
a good
come
example of
back,
this.
yay!
But we fear with Jodie Comer, I guess, that sort of like these are just two people who are probably just in a bad situation, just like she is, you know, who have experienced hostility from other people. But you're right, we start
Mm,
fearing the worst because these
yeah.
situations where people are desperate are often interpreted as bringing out the worst in everybody. And we see a
Mm,
good, even though actually Jodie Comer, in a way, treats them worse than they treat her because she steals the car, we feel that it's justified because of the threat that they appear to pose. Um,
mm,
but I mean, with the woman who keeps saying no, 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 I felt she'd almost like seemed to be becoming slightly manic, and I wondered whether
yeah,
kind
yeah.
of representation of the kind of the impact on mental health and so on
That's true.
kind of
Yeah, I actually didn't
situation
interpret it that
has
way,
as
but
well.
yeah.
This does nicely make us think about Benedict Cumberbatch, the most sort of beautiful encounter in the film, where again they are approaching, looking for food through sort of
Mm,
empty houses and so on, and there's this moment of, is this another man to fear,
yeah,
essentially lured,
yeah.
as it were, by food? Now we, of course, see that it's
It's Benedict
thank
Cumberbatch.
goodness they have found Benedict Cumberbatch and everything is going to be okay. But it has that moment of kind of like being slightly sinister to start with, and then actually this is somebody who quite genuinely is trying to help and offer them something, and we get this very different moment of temporary situational friendship that occurs. So I mean, what did you think of that scene? Because it's one of my favorite from that little.
Yeah, I mean, it had a very like classic getting drunk. They're like showing this bottle of vodka, which, by the way, oh god, I literally couldn't even in the apocalypse. Even then, I
even
could
the
not.
apocalypse, you're not drinking.
Not even in the
neat
apocalypse.
vodka.
Oh god, I actually think like I would lose all of the food I just consumed. But anyways, yeah, they're getting drunk around the campfire, having a little dance. Very classic kind of scene. But I don't know, it was very, I don't know. I think it was like a well kind of, it was like one of those like depictions of like, oh, even in these like moments of like true disasters, people can still find kind of companionship and camaraderie and also have like a nice time, even like despite, in the face of like these terrible things going on. But
almost, I think, kind of because of these terrible things, they sort of let loose, and there's this like fine line between kind of like this sort of euphoric happiness and this terrible grief. So and we see that really in kind of like Benedict Cumberbatch's character's segue into his melancholia, where he reveals his backstory, and this really important theme, I think, that comes up in the second part of the film that he introduces, which is essentially Jodie Comer and Catherine Waterston are trying to travel out to one of the islands on which her friend has formed a commune, safe away from the mainland and so on. We'll come back to that. And they ask Benedict Cumberbatch only for him to reveal that he has left the commune and is actually going back to the city where his family had all been killed. And his reasoning was that the people on the commune want to forget, and he wants to remember, and he wants to go back and remember in the most horrific place.
Yeah.
Because he thinks it will be sharper. What did you think about that as a like his
like reasoning is to go back?
Yeah.
I mean, like my question, like what does he mean by the word sharp? Like I can imagine, going back and sort of reliving those moments where he sort of saw his family, die in front of him. Yeah, I mean the pain would probably be a lot sharper, it wouldn't feel as sort of like, distanced or, dull in that sense. But what is the purpose of that?
I mean, he obviously, his grief is very much bound up with guilt, because we obviously don't see this scene, we only hear his very short description of it, but he was at the end of the bridge whilst his wife was carrying their two children in the center of the bridge when the bridge collapsed into the water. And again, it's one of these moments of horrific kind of violence and loss of life that we're just left to imagine. So one imagines that it's partly his kind of guilt that is driving him to want to feel pain because he's the survivor. But there is something, I suppose, more positive that we might take out of it, which is this idea that if these things are out of sight, out of mind, like we've talked about with, for example, flooding occurrences across the world, where we might see the occasional news broadcast, especially if it's in sort of a place like Europe rather than a place like Asia. But by and large, we don't hang on to these things, and therefore maybe we don't react to them, we don't make changes, we don't better things. So although he doesn't extrapolate that far, that might be an interpretation, perhaps. Though I'd say that one thing about this film is it really doesn't try and like say there is kind of like one good thing to sort of take away, or this is the message, or you should do things like this. It's constantly leaving us questioning kind of what the right thing is. Which links really well with the actual life on the commune, because they're really conspicuously disenfranchising themselves. The rest of the world. So Jodie Comer and Catherine Waterston, they get to the pier. Again, we get this kind of like, how long are you going to wait for this boat that may or may not turn up? There's a sort of act of faith going on there in a way, especially Jodie Comer, who is trusting entirely on Catherine Waterston's word this is going to happen. But lo and behold, Gina McKee, another great face is. When I first saw Notting Hill, I was obsessed with Gina McKee. She was one of my first like actor crushes in the whatever that is, the 90s, noughties, whatever. Loved her. So here she is. She does play a good sort of slightly harsh senior sinister character now, depending on how you view this. But anyway, we learn that she's left behind her life of finance, and she and these like-minded, slightly kind of hippie type people are gathered on this island, presumably set up because she had lots of money.
Yes.
Generally, I don't know, with rising sea levels, you might say living on an island was a very bad idea, but we see that it's obviously like, this is a really rocky, like almost mountainous kind of place with the building right up the top. So I guess they're all right for,
for
100 years or something.
You know what would have been the best thing? Big boats. That's what I'm saying. Everyone start living on a boat, big boat. This is going to save you. This is where you want the commune. Yeah, exactly.
He had a good thing going there.
Big boat, big arc. That's what we're going for. That's where my commune's going to be. Anyways, yeah.
Which makes me think of The Last Ship. I've written about it in the newsletter before, but that is a ship in the apocalypse narrative. Very good show. Anyway, what do we think of the commune? And I guess Jodie Comer.
Yeah, it seems very idyllic, I think so. Where is this meant to be? They say like the North Pier. Where what does that mean?
We're not told exactly, but I guess that we're from the kind of like landscape and stuff. We must be off the coast of Scotland, but where exactly? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's got that very kind of like British looking kind of seaside vibe to it, which I really like. It's just very good vibes. But yeah, I mean, you've gone from this kind of moment, this background of Jodie Comer kind of like fighting for her life, like trudging along through these marshlands to like sitting at a kitchen table and getting poured a cup of tea, and it suddenly feels all very normal. But yeah, I mean, it all feels very like idealistic of like, oh, nothing's going wrong. Gina McKee, her character's kind of like trying to shut out this like outside world, and I don't know, what do you think? Like, do you sort of see some sort of not necessarily like fascist ideology in that, but kind of being like, oh, everything's okay in paradise?
I mean, it does remind me of, I guess, things like the beach, for example, where you see this absolutely like idealized community on an island, and then you get the kind of like dark side and sort of looking behind it. We don't see anything that's particularly bad here, apart from the fact that they don't want to hold on to the things that they have lost. I mean, Gina McKee asks for the radio to be turned off so that they're not picking up the kind of limited amount of information from the mainland. And she, I suppose, depending on how you look at it, is she quite hostile to Jodie Comer for not kind of embracing the life, or is she just quite realistic that having one person in the commune who doesn't buy into the ideology is going to undermine it for everyone? I think that's probably true. But there is something about this idea that, it's very similar to getting on a spaceship and going to another planet when the world goes to shit. Yeah, we've talked about that. It's like the little version of that where you actually say, we're just going to make our own community that doesn't worry about everybody else. It could be beautiful and amazing, but I think we're left with this idea that it's somehow stepping away from responsibility. Perhaps especially if you're somebody who has made a lot of money and so on within the kind of corporate system, stepping away might be commendable, but it's also like not giving back potentially as well. And I think it's interesting that there's this difference between like the rational thing that Jodie Comer's like, this is like rationally speaking, this is a good place to be. And like instinctually, she knows that it's not right for her. What about the fact that there's this question about whether she should leave the child or not?
I thought they were going to be like, you have to leave your child here. Like, we're not going to let you go with your child. I thought there was going to be.
You were going down the more sinister cult kind of.
And I was like,
potential there.
I don't know, because they were like going on about this whole, obviously, we're a commune, we're here for the community, and like, okay, if they considered that child as like an individual, and were like, okay, as a community, we've decided that what's best is for this child to stay here. And they were like, Jodie Comer, you can't take him off the island. I don't know, it could have been a very like realistic, like the ideology that they had going, it could have gone down that route, to be fair. But yeah, I mean, again, I think the advice they gave was like fair, is reasonable. Yeah, she very well could have died out there, and then her child die along with her.
And again, I guess this sort of sense of fear is one that we, the viewer, kind of bring to the film, perhaps because we've seen this sort of thing before. We know kind of like we're sort of hanging on to our liberal identity of thinking, kind of like my body, my child, my right to do what I want with it. Society, this tiny little commune of sort of well-meaning people can't take that away from me. You're right, they don't actually do that. But I guess there is a real tension about whether, following her kind of emotional instinct in this way and choosing, I guess, her possibly dead husband over her very much alive best friend, who frankly has been a great deal more useful to her of late than Joel Fry. Sorry, I know you want Joel Fry to triumph, but Catherine Waterston kind of did more.
She did.
But yeah, there's some sort of sense of like instinctiveness, a sense of home, and we also see, I guess, a real image of like Jodie Comer's sort of misery and depression and so on. There's a sort of Gina McKee says that she's sort of remembering and wants to go back to like a world that doesn't exist anymore, a life that doesn't exist anymore. But I don't think that there is necessarily that. I think it's more the sort of like almost like an acceptance process that even if it's bad, you still want to return to it, maybe.
No, exactly. Yeah. On her journeys back home, like, what do you think the efficacy of the whole, as we were talking about before, the like stealing of the car? So basically, what happens with this couple and the car? Where we think, I personally interpreted, I'm very cynical, is what I picked up across this whole film. I'm just very like, something terrible is about to happen. But yeah, where there's this couple, Jodie Comer pretends to walk away and just gets into their car and drives off. God, the anxiety from that was through the roof. But what do you think, like, ethically?
I guess, again, it comes down to this idea about if we view this solely through the kind of lens of the role of the mother to protect their child at all costs. I guess it's like, whether you feel that it's right to report somebody for stealing baby formula, right? I don't know. Also, I guess there was this feeling that she did give them an option to kind of help on a more mutual term. She knows that it's kind of wrong, she says to the baby, you must never tell anybody about this. I can see your disapproving face.
Yeah, it's a very like, again, in these dystopias, there's always a bit of like a kill or be killed kind of vibe
exactly.
to the whole thing.
I mean, she has been walking for quite a long time, and she does have like burgeoning trench foot or something.
Yeah. Actually, you know what? She did drop her bag, so maybe it's just a fair trade.
Maybe. Yeah.
Maybe, maybe she's got some real goodies up in there.
It's interesting that when you were sort of talking about being cynical, I quite recently, and I put this in the show notes because for the life of me, I cannot remember the name of this book, but I'm going to dig it out. Quite recently read a novel. I'm pretty much 100% certain it was a novel. I'm finding increasingly, I find it difficult to remember whether I've like watched something or read it or whatever. But there's a scene in it quite similarly, like idea of like one car, I don't know, breaks down, another one stops to help or something. But anyway, like an encounter on a road, and it's a trap, it's an ambush. These are people who basically ambush other travelers on the road and sort of kill them and take the stuff, right? So in a similar sort of dystopian context. So we're not alone in thinking that it was a bit kind of kill or be killed situation. This is gets imagined quite a lot. And you're right with like The Last of Us, we've talked a lot about the idea of the fact they don't stop to help. So maybe there's a different set of rules in circumstances of desperation, especially when you're responsible for the life of a small child. But anyway, people write in, tell us what your ethical feelings on this are. Anyway, the final thing is that we learn that there is a cleanup operation and that for people who are in good health and able to work,
able-bodied
people, so it's reminded me a bit of Threads, where again, they only sort of fed the able-bodied, everyone else just allowed to die off. Once again, I do not survive the apocalypse. But
Sorry, Claire.
okay. I know, no. But she gets back to London on account of this. Again, this raises questions, doesn't it, about kind of the responsibility of the state to all of its people versus
Yeah, all
some
of
of its
us.
people.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
yeah, literally, like, she only has freedom of movement because she is able-bodied, and
yeah,
like in a number of sense, literally in a physical sense of her walking like miles across,
yeah.
like, and not no wheelchairs about to get through that
No,
woodland,
exactly. That
like,
is very
you know,
true. Not to
and
confuse
then
that.
yeah, she gets to this like volunteer bus or whatever for the cleanup, and again, she's only able to get on because she's in good health and
Yeah,
can walk
yeah.
and everything. So yeah, exactly. It's just like, she's only able to like travel all that way because of her abilities.
Still, I mean, I think that basically it would be fine because I'd have been drowned in the first washout. You wouldn't have to worry about
Yeah,
me
it would have been
there.
quick. It would have been
Yeah,
fine.
exactly. um,
Oh,
but yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously it is this idea about what you do about dependence is one that society has to deal with all the time. How do you make sure that people who can't contribute in the same way as others are still not just left to starve or whatever, but it
mm,
becomes more pressing in these kind of circumstances. And I guess we're return to the idea that it comes down to altruism, essentially, like somebody charitably making sure that this other person is still okay because they're not going to be supported by the main systems.
yeah,
But she does return to London. We get the very moving board of missing people, which is
yes.
so full of faces that she doesn't even notice herself.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't even
Yeah,
notice her on
they like
there.
zoom
I
in
didn't
like a
even
moment
notice.
for you
I'm
to see that
still
there's
like,
her photo. But yeah, you're right. It's very hard because
oh,
it's
that's
just
so
like the
cute.
abundance of people who've been lost.
Yeah.
And then eventually by boat through the flooded London street, really flooded, up to like
Yes. Up to
bus,
bus,
upper
double
bus.
decker bus
Yeah,
level. Yeah.
exactly. She finally gets back to her home where the water is receding. So should we talk about that kind of final scene where she brings Zeb back into there?
Yeah.
Again, total panic for me because it's just like, okay, we got there, everything was great, but look at the cleaning. Look
I
at,
know, this is literally horrific. Good
exactly. And of
luck.
course,
You put
I'm not
your
necessarily convinced that anyone's going to stop this from happening again.
6-month-old baby on the floor. What are you doing? I know, I
I mean,
mean,
she doesn't
but
really have a
yeah,
lot of choice, does she? I suppose
no, she doesn't.
worse. He's been clambering around in sort of Highland bogs for a while. So, um,
Yeah, no, his immunity is like through the
yeah.
roof right now,
But
so it's
yeah,
okay.
if at the moment, like you were describing plumbing disasters as part of renovating houses, my parents had a pipe burst once, went down through the ceiling of their sitting room, and
Oh
call the
dear.
insurance company, and they they bring in these big drying out fans, and they replace your carpet, and they patch up your ceiling. But in this scenario, are we really
Yeah,
expecting
no
any of that to
insurance
work out?
company's
Nobody's
gonna,
coming to rescue
yeah.
you. She's, dustpan and brushing her own table, but there's quite a bit more to go. Like the mattress is soaked
Literally so
completely.
grim.
Oh,
Yeah,
but as you said, I guess it is still a slightly more optimistic ending, and certainly the way that she talks
that's
to the
true.
baby, well, partly makes you realize she's only had a baby to talk to for quite a long time.
Oh, yeah, you know what? Like the way that she is, like she interacts with her child, like I don't know. I'm very confident she's a very good mother. Just like the whole like, oh God, and in the like when she gets to London, there's a little peekaboo sequence, and then
Oh
like Jodie
God,
Comer starts like crying
heart-wrenching,
into
isn't it?
her like, oh, Oscar-winning
Yeah,
scene, so good. I was like, oh, I'm literally like getting torn apart by this.
yeah,
But yeah, yeah,
absolutely. It's one of the many scenes where we see that kind of like moment of overwhelm, and then she kind of
yeah,
like moves through it. The other one that really moved me was when she goes swimming out into the sea off
yes,
Commune Island, and especially they do this quite a bit, but they use like an upside down film, and they have her like hanging from the sea,
yeah,
as it were, and it
yeah,
just
yeah.
felt like that idea of kind of like being stuck in this sort of limbo of the water and the outcome of the flooding and so on.
Mm.
Whereas that kind of sense of dry land right at the end where they're back in the kitchen and the water has gone and so on. What did you think when we heard the door open? Were you going for the optimistic ending,
No,
or
I
we
was
were
like, there's
still
no way it's gonna be some random man. And I was like, oh, she's got back doors to escape through. It'll be fine. I was like, yeah, it's gonna be Joel Fry. Joel Fry. Joel Fry walked in. I was like, oh, it's Joel Fry. But it was, yeah. Like, what did you think? Yeah, after they saw
I
each
think
other,
that there was still that little element of tension.
really,
Like,
really.
you know, is this really going to be him?
No, at
What I
that
liked
point,
was
all
you
my
were,
cynicism spent. You know, that
yeah,
was
yeah,
just
you're
like,
like,
this
gotta
is
have something
happening.
good happen.
Yeah. Anyways, go on. You're saying.
Yeah. I liked the fact that it wasn't a kind of like emotional sort of reunion. That sense of like the profound kind of like loss and separation and so on still seemed to hang really heavy on them both. He felt really kind of like, I don't know, like kind of cowed by sort of everything he'd been through. And yet the baby is just like gurgling away and
Yeah, goes for a little walk.
yeah, and takes his first step. Yeah, that's
Oh,
right. But
yeah.
which again, I guess if you're thinking about this idea of kind of the baby as the future and things like that.
Yeah, and then the end we start with is like
Yeah,
that, you
yeah,
know, him taking his
yeah,
first steps is
yeah,
also like a sort of beginning of
yeah,
senses.
yeah.
I don't know, yeah, I think, well, yeah, so what do you think? We haven't really discussed this. It was like before, but me and Claire were discussing what we think the title actually means. Like, how do you interpret it?
I think it has to allude in some way to this idea that there's a sort of there's an arc of development in terms of kind of the character of Jodie Comer, the relationship, the kind of whole process of bringing a child into the world that feels like it was the story, but it's almost like the story is what's going to happen after all of this. Like this is a new beginning as well as an end of something. So maybe it's about that, the kind of the change, the
Yeah, I
development and so on.
agree. Yeah.
I would also like to think that it's like the end of this particular flood and the beginning of introducing beavers and generally sorting
More
out
beavers and
beavers,
more boats. Beavers and
yes,
boats.
beavers and boats. Our new tagline. That idea that, you know, this needs to be a fresh start of some sort, perhaps. And this idea that you go back to the beginning, you go back to the kind of like this destroyed house and you start from there rather than going off and sort of saying, no, I'm just going to give up on the world or whatever. Perhaps that as well. What about you? Any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Yeah, profoundly. I think it also kind of goes hand in hand with what I was saying about the whole name theory, where I think, yeah, so it's like the point where we see them reunite is the new start, but also the end of the story. But the kind of main focus, the like literal last couple seconds, is the point at which Zeb takes his first steps. And I think again, instead of focusing on, oh, you know, Jodie Comer's and Joel Fry's
We
embrace
don't
and
see them
whatever, we
at
don't
all.
see
No,
that.
you're
We
right.
actually see just a focus on Zeb and how
Yeah.
he is that like the end. Well, you know, he's the start that
Yeah.
kind of happens at the end of the story. I think it's yeah, it's a nice like focus on like, okay, this is like the next generation that we actually need to build a safer, better infrastructure for when these things will happen again. And also like not only being like, oh, we're gonna make sure next time a flood happens, it's not gonna be like that, but also trying to like actually stop climate change maybe from
Exactly.
making things
Yeah.
get worse any further, which is just I mean with the whole tipping point thing, we'll see how that goes, but yeah, it's a very good film. I do recommend to anyone who hasn't seen it.
Yeah, if you accept it for kind of like what it is and you really, I think it's a film you really have to watch because so much of it, there's no dialogue, you know, you're really just kind of like following the movements on the screen, the settings, the characters and so on, through the visual side of things, but it is very beautiful. So thank you for listening to our discussion. Please do let us know if you have any further thoughts. We are going to reconvene in 2 weeks' time for Society of the Snow. Marsha, this is your
Yeah, we'll
suggestion.
see if it's any good. I actually haven't seen it yet, so yeah, maybe it'll
There
be
you
a
go.
really,
Okay,
really
right.
bad and boring
Suspense all
episode.
round.
We'll find out. Stay tuned to find out.
And you can catch up with the list of things that are coming up if you subscribe to our newsletter on Substack, Dystopian Fiction Current Affairs. And you can also follow us on Instagram and possible other places that Marsha is going to introduce us to.
Oh yeah, we're gonna get a Letterboxd account, everyone. Yeah, Dystopian Fiction at Letterboxd.
Yeah, sounds good.
We'll keep everyone posted on what that will be, actually.
So check out Instagram for now, Dystopian Fiction Current Affairs. You can find all the links in the link tree there. And we very much look forward to hearing your opinions and to re-entering your ears in a fortnight's time. So thank you very much, audience. Thank you, Marsha.
Thank you.